Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about some weed management preparation in the fall that can help you with spring in some of your flower beds. This isn't my active area to do research, but I have lots of experience doing this, so we'll have a few tidbits of advice that I can give you. I think a good example is to show you this from our Dodge County Master Gardeners. I stole this from there that shows you some of the positive aspects and when you can do it right, how things can look. Really, when we talk about flower beds and weed management, we have lots of examples of good examples where things work well. We've got what I would term bad examples that where this was supposed to have some weed suppression and did not. And we'll talk about this example later. And then we have the ugly that I like to say. We have situations where there was really no attempt at any weed management or minimal attempt, and we have things like garlic mustard that you can see here that's growing in our flower bed, not really desirable. So I kind of prepping for this, I wanted you to think about a few things to consider, and I'll go into these a little more in depth about fall weed management for your flower beds. The biggest one is, well, what do you plan to grow in the spring? What plants do you want to grow, and how are you going to grow them, and when do they grow? Because there's lots of different tools that fit better or worse depending on when a plant is growing and what plants are growing. And then really from a weed science perspective is, what are the weeds that you're dealing with historically in this flower beds? They do change from time to time, but generally around 15 or so weeds typically are common in someone's backyard. So we'll talk about that. And then what are your management options that you are willing to use? There's tools available. All have positive and negative aspects. And we'll just try to briefly hit on some of these. But the key thing is to be thinking now, so when spring hits, you can hit the ground running. Why is fall a better time than spring to do this? Well, some of these weeds are going to be starting to germinate now or into early winter. And so getting a head start on some of that management can really be a benefit. Some of these techniques like herbicides in the fall work really well with some of our perennials. Some of these activities we're going to be talking about doing can coincide with kind of some of the fall seasonal activities of kind of cleanup. And I would say you have more time in the fall to do this versus spring when you're growing plants, you're getting orders in, you're prepping soil. We always run out of time to do these in the spring. So I think fall is a good time to start thinking about some of these things. Okay, first off, what plants do you want to grow in these flower beds? This can really, is really important information to know. I just kind of pulled up some examples. What if you're planting with annuals, that you're planting all of them in the spring? Then we have lots of flexibility and things that we can do beforehand and not worry about harming some of these plants. Well, what if it's all woody ornamental shrubs? Well, then it's going to be tough if they're already existing to put down some fabric mulch or some of these other things. And probably many of you are in this mixture category. This is where it can be a challenge to do some of these things and why we probably just rely really heavily on mulch. So we need to think about what plants we're going to be growing to deal with. So here's just some really good examples. Thinking about the seasonality and timing is really important. If you're growing tulips, you got to realize you're supposed to be getting them in the ground now, right? And then they're going to be coming up first thing in the spring. And so getting some of your weed management stuff in place now can really be helpful to do that and to be thinking about that. And we'll talk about some unique aspects and things that I've done in the past that I really like. Well, or if we have some permanent structures like up here, like rocks or bricks that may get in the way of this, what are our plans with these woody plants versus these, and how are we going to deal with those two? So just thinking about those plants will help you understand what some of the challenges might be. But this is really what I love talking about is weeds. Understanding which weeds you're trying to manage is really, really important. I would argue that if we could go to properties, probably a property has less than 15 weeds that they battle every year. And it's probably usually more like 8 to 6. And probably of those 8 to 6, it's probably 3 or 4 that are really problematic. So knowing these weeds can really help you develop a management approach that really tailors to their weak link. So knowledge of those weed species is really, really important. So you have the right approach for the right weed or weed complex. So things that we need to know is Is your weed an annual or is it a perennial? That's really important in determining what techniques we're going to use. Things we also want to know is, well, when do they germinate or emerge? Some will germinate starting now. We have some of the speed wells that are actually germinating that you'll see be problems. Some are in early spring and some are in later spring. Knowing that can help us understand when we need to get these management techniques out too. So this is really important information that we need to know. On my website, Renz Weed Science, I have some links to this that you've seen throughout the presentation, and I'm sure Peggy's typing it into the chat box right now. We have lots of resources that can help with this. If you go to the resources tab and look at agricultural weed identification fact sheets, we've got a lot of one-page fact sheets that highlight how to identify these species and can really help with identification. If you go to the tools bar, we have a weed identification website that can help with weed ID too. But one of the other tools that's really neat that a lot of people don't know about is this thing called Weedometer. This Weedometer is really neat. You can click on this link here, and what happens is it shows you some of our common annual weeds and perennial weeds and when they germinate and when they flower. So this can really give you an idea of when you need to have some of these tools and practices in place. So some neat resources that are available on your fingertips. Okay, so that's just kind of the first two we blew through really quickly. Now the hard one, well, what weed management tools are you willing to use? We've got lots of tools, mulch and lots of different types of mulch. We've got herbicides, physical removal, and then soil solarization, or this other term, which is fancy term for just putting out a tarp. Occultation, if I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. So let's first talk about mulch. This is by far probably our best tool that we can utilize and easiest tool. There's lots of different forms, and we'll talk about the pluses and minuses very briefly, but the basic approach with mulch is you're putting a thick layer of mulch in there that does two things. One, you're putting it there before those weed seeds germinate, and many of those weed seeds needs light to be intercepted and hit those weed seeds to cause them to germinate. So if you can put this material on top of the soil before those weed seeds germinate, you will prevent them from germinating or reduce the number that are germinating. And then also, if they do germinate, we try and put a thick enough layer in there that they don't have enough resources to grow through that mulch and actually hit sunlight and survive. So that's the basic concept of it. Really effective, probably the tool that many of you, if not all of you, are using. But picking the right material can be complicated. There's lots of information on the artificial fabrics, so I'm not going to go into details on those. But picking the right material can be really, really complicated, and there's some good resources, I think, through the Learning Store and on the web that can help you with that. But I want you to think about a couple things. Think about what material you want, how long you want it to last, and is it going to fit into this flower bed in your overall yard, right? So there's pluses and minuses to all these. And in general, some mulches will persist for a long time. The larger they are and the more carbon they have in them or cellulose, they tend to last longer. But there's a wide range of them that you can look for. And I think you want to look for ones that last longer versus shorter times, particularly if you're going to apply it in the fall. And one of the big things there's a lot of interest in is this leaf mulch. As you can see here, works really, really well. A lot of benefits, a lot of positive attributes with this leaf mulch, but it does not last long. And so a lot of people have been using this. My neighbor, this is a picture of their front yard, got it restored, put a bunch of this leaf mulch on, put like multiple inches, looked great in the fall. Come spring, when plants started to grow, what you can see is it's all degraded, and all those weeds have plenty of ability to establish. So be thinking about that if you're going to use leaf mulch. You have to reapply it in the spring. So pick your mulch material carefully. Another issue to be aware of too is that some of this material can be contaminated with weed seeds. Perennial weed parts is also really bad, and invasive worms like jumping worms, we're always concerned about spreading those around. So be careful about what you're adding that might be contaminated. And really the key is with any type of mulch is you need lots of it. Now this is a picture of some work that we were doing at an ag research station, but it actually sums up this point to a T. It was one field. The picture on your left is switchgrass, which was blown over and laid over and had about a good 4 to 6 inches of mulch. Believe it or not, to about 5 paces to the right of where I took this picture was an area that didn't have any of this mulch that persisted. Same day, exact same time you took the picture. And look, we have perennial weeds up, you have foxtails that are emerging, and it's just a weedy mess. And so the amount of organic material is the key to having success in mulch, and more is better than less. I think starting at 2 inches is what I like to say. Depending on the size of the mulch material, how you might need to add more or less, but I think that 1 to 2 inch frame is a good starting point, potentially adding to it from there, depending on how long you want it to last and other things. So I recommend adding this mulch in the fall or even over the winter if possible. I know how many of you guys do this? Probably none or very, very few, but it's a really good opportunity. Many of our winter annual weeds are germinating now and can continue to germinate through late fall and even into early winter. And our perennial weeds are growing really early in the spring in many cases before when you're putting your mulch out. So you miss that window to suppress those. So think in your head, when do I typically apply my mulch? My guess is most of you guys are in this early May to mid-May timeframe. Maybe if you're lucky, late April. And I want to show you a series of pictures of Creeping Charlie. This is what Creeping Charlie looks like in my yard in middle of March in Madison. By late March, it is greening up just barely. But look at it, by early April, it's already actively growing, rapidly spreading and green, and it's flowering by the middle of April. So if we're relying on our mulch to provide us suppression, we just gave this plant, a month to grow without any competition. So again, the importance of getting that mulch down early, particularly if you have perennial weeds that emerge early, like Creepy Charlie. And here it looks later in April too. One option that I really like that's interesting, and I've done this in my yard and my tulip beds and had really good success, is you plant grasses in the fall in early September, like oats. Oats will grow, get about 6 to 8 inches tall, and then the winter temperatures will kill those oats. And you can actually have that as mulch, and then you don't have to do anything moving forward too. So this is another option that has been widely used in turf establishment, but you can use it in a flower bed too and have some success. You have something green to look at in the fall. And this is just an example of what it looks like the next spring. We had turf grass that came up in here, but as you can see, no weeds where we did have those oats grown. So with all of these mulches, I think the reality is that very rarely do we get 100% weed control, because we can get weed seeds that blow in on top of the mulch. We get, an animal will dig a hole or something and allow for them to establish. So we do need to be thinking about inspecting and removing those weeds that are escapes. It will make your job a lot easier because it's easier to manage those, but don't expect 100% control from any mulch. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about physical removal. Physical removal is really effective, but it can be difficult and painful. So I'll just provide this example I did with Creeping Charlie. It was in a small flower bed that was about a square meter or two by the side of my house. What I simply did was I dug up that a foot of that soil, sifted through that soil, removed all the perennial parts, put it back in, and now I have very little Creeping Charlie. Occasionally I get 1 or 2 plants that's really easy to remove where it was just a mess before. So very time challenging to do, but very, very difficult. This is why Creeping Charlie is so difficult to remove. It has this little perennial root. We often get this little root, but it breaks right here, and we don't realize there's a large root attached to it where the plant keeps coming back from. So physical removal is a good option, but it's really time consuming and not realistic in most cases. And then we have herbicides. Herbicides are an effective option. They can work really well on controlling our perennial weeds that are difficult to manage in many of our areas, particularly applications in the fall are really effective. But we need to be careful in using them. We need to follow the directions on the label. because if you misuse or don't follow those directions, you can cause harm to yourself, your property, or the environment. So be careful when using these and make sure to follow those directions. Pick your herbicides carefully if you're going to use them. Make sure they're registered for use in these flower beds or wherever you're using it. Systemic herbicides like glyphosate are really good options in the fall to move that herbicide into the roots and provide long-term control so you don't have to worry about controlling it the next spring. But again, apply it at the correct timing and rate and follow those directions. I do want to point out that DATCAP has a really good website. If you do have some herbicide or consider buying a herbicide and want to know if you can use it and you're having trouble finding the label, you can go to this website that DATCAP has, click on Look Up a Pesticide Product. This will come up and you can search by the product name and actually get the active ingredient. It'll actually tell you what sites it's labeled for, and it can make it a little bit easier to find some of that information. And if you actually don't have a label, it'll have a copy of the label there for you to look at. All right, so how well do some of these work? A lot of people are like, oh, I just spray my perennial weeds in the spring and they work great. Here's just some data to show you how well it works. These two green bars, the blue and green bar on the left, were sprayed in the fall with Roundup. These two, the lighter green and the yellow, were sprayed in the spring. And we can see we're getting much, but really good control in the spring. While we can eventually get higher control later in May, we never get to that same result that we get with effective fall control. So good fall herbicides are a good option, and now is a great time to do them with fall weather approaching. If you're going to apply in the fall, when do we want to apply them? Well, the short answer is we recommend making these applications basically between now until the temperatures aren't correct. And the recommendation that we give for temperatures is you want to make an application when the daytime temps are going to get above 50 degrees Fahrenheit for at least one day when you're applying or the day after you're applying. So, well, when does that happen in Wisconsin? It can happen in a lot of times. On average, we can get a whole bunch of those days well through October. I will say, I'll show you a slide in the next page that'll kind of highlight that that's quite a bit variable depending on where you live, but in October, you should get several good days to do that. And we really need those plant leaves to be green and growing. So that's kind of the key. If they're already senesced from a hard frost, we're going to get reduced or no control at all. And there's just a slide showing you it varies whether you're in the north and the south. I think you guys can figure that one out. Just really briefly, soil solarization, as a lot of people are interested in that. That's simply a situation where you're applying a clear tarp over the area. You're allowing that light to go through the tarp, heats the soil, and it's going to kill some of those. It's going to stimulate germination of a lot of annual weed seeds, and it's going to kill them so that they reduces the seed bank. The key is what you want to do is till the soil before putting them on. Use a thicker versus a thinner clear tarp. And then you need to leave that tarp on for quite a bit of time. And the goal is you need to keep that temperature above 100 degrees, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is the challenge. In a hot climate like out in the West, you can get really good results in 3 to 4 weeks when those temperatures are hot. But in a cooler climate like ours, it's usually going to take 6, maybe even 8 weeks to keep those high temperatures. And it doesn't kill perennial weeds. It can suppress them, but doesn't kill them. So we're probably already too late in the season to use soil solarization now. We probably should have started that in the middle of August to really good effective results. And you need to leave it on for a long time. And that's the big challenge. Here's just a picture of what you can see the before and after. And you can see we're seeing good results, but still some plants do survive. And Minnesota's got a good resource on this. Tarping is another option that I don't personally like, but a lot of people do use it. It's the same as soil solarization, but you're using a material that light can't penetrate, so it doesn't heat up as fast. It does have a place, but usually it's going to take 8 to 10 weeks to apply it. You need to put it on in August to get some level of control. So again, probably missed the window here, but there are some opportunities, and Virginia Tech has a good website with information on that. Okay, I know I'm running short on time, so I just want to summarize some random suggestions based on what I've said. So out of everything I've said, realize when we're thinking about weeds and trying to prevent weeds, the best defense is vigorous and dense plant growth. So try and get really good, well-adapted plant species, take care of your soil, have good fertility to get them growing well, and that's going to be your best defense for weed management. These other techniques are just going to supplement it. We can rely on mulch, we can rely on herbicides, we can rely on soil solarization, but don't rely on any one. Be able to integrate other management techniques. And what I always like to say, a little bit of maintenance, AKA love, and visiting that site and doing work can go a long way. So don't expect 100% control. You can walk away and come back and it'll still look good. You need to still maintain that. And then it's also difficult to eliminate them long term. So prioritize and really think smart, really focus on those perennials are really the problematic species. And hopefully if you do all that, you can have some enough free time to take a walk in the woods at the end of the day and not be spending all your time managing weeds in the summer. That's my last slide. I think I've saved a couple minutes for questions. So there's my website if you need it. I will exit out, and if there's time for questions, I'd love to answer them.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Yeah, we probably could talk hours and hours about all the different weeds and weed control options. I will try to hand you a couple of questions here. One that I just saw pop up was about using preen, that product preen. Is that a good choice for our flower beds?
So yes, depending on if you're using perennial flowers. So how preen works is, so first I should say yes in the spring before the weeds germinate. We don't want to apply it now because we're putting a herbicide out there and it's just sitting in the soil degrading and it's going to be at a lower rate or absent. So while preen works is it creates a layer in the soil when weed seeds germinate, those weed seeds absorb that herbicide from the soil and they die before they even emerge. So it works great for annual weeds. Not going to work on perennials, but it breaks down rapidly. So, depending on the rate you apply, and there's a whole bunch of different versions of preen, you're going to get around a month, maybe a little bit more suppression. So if you have problems with small seeded annuals, it works great. Larger seeded annuals, they probably won't work the best. I would try to recommend applying preen in addition to some of the other techniques like mulch or something like that.
Great. I know a lot of people use a non-chemical option of using cardboard down, and I think that is essentially just what you were saying about, choosing your material. But do you have any comments about putting cardboard down and then putting soil and mulch on top of that?
Yeah, that's a great option. The key is you need to have a plan. Like you have to cut holes for where those perennials are so they have a place that they can grow through. Or if you're going to plant plants into there, you need to cut holes and be prepared to do that. But cardboard is awesome. It works really well. I know some people are vegetable weed scientist Jed uses multiple layers of just newspaper and puts like grass clippings over them to keep them down. So any of those things are great options that you can utilize, particularly in a flower bed where you have lots of perennials and you can just put them together. There will always be gaps where weeds will come in. Realize that if we get we had a bunch of rainstorm events, you can get soil that moves in and it'll land on top of that. There'll be weeds in that soil and weeds will still germinate, but it'll be a lot less and easier to manage.
Mm-hmm. We're getting lots of questions about specific weeds, so I'll just mention here, and Peggy, if you could put it in the chat, we do have a Ask a Gardening question form available from the Extension Horticulture website, and we can certainly give resources through that and answer very specific questions using the Ask a Gardening question form, where we can customize answers for your specific situation. So if I don't get to your question today, folks, put your question in that form and we will make sure to get it answered.
Yeah, and
I
I'll
guess,
just
yeah, go ahead.
say right there, the key is knowing the weed species is critical, but if you don't, you need to know, is it a perennial or an annual or a biennial? Or does it have a small seed or a large seed? And why that seed size is important. The larger the seed, it can emerge from a deeper depth and survive. And also the larger seeds are much more tolerant to many of our herbicides like preen and other pre-emergent herbicides that we can use.
Those are really excellent points. Yes, we definitely keep that in mind. I'm just scrolling through. There's lots of questions here. Um, Here's one maybe to consider is how long do those seeds remain in the soil? How long does that seed bank stay in there?
Okay, this is the number one answer of any scientist at all. It depends. It
Yeah.
depends on the species. So we can have seeds like we do a lot of work. I know this isn't a horticultural weed, but common buckthorn. It only lasts 2 years in the soil. After 3 years, 99.8% of all those seeds are gone.
Wow.
But then we have some hard-seeded weed seeds that can last decades in the soil. So it really depends on the seed type. As a general rule of thumb, the over 50% to 75% of those seeds are going to be depleted if you don't allow any to flower within 1 to 2 years. But that other 25% could last a decade or more, depending on the species too. The other key to consider is you got to prevent those new weed seeds from coming in from the environment. And while we could keep those areas weed-free and not flowering, realize if you have cats or raccoons or other animals or wind or rain, lots of things can bring weed seeds in to your flower beds. And you can be bringing it in with new soil too, which is probably the most common one.
Sure. What if someone is just completely starting over? They're, have a site, maybe it has turf or weeds. They don't know what kind of weeds, but they just want to get rid of everything and then be able to kind of have, whether it's a flower garden or a vegetable garden, but just kind of the starting over point. What are some
Yeah.
recommendations?
So what I think is if we were having this conversation in like July, I would say like soils, if you have the time and energy and bandwidth, soil solarization is great because it's a really good, you till the soil, put that on for 6 to 8 weeks. It is literally cooking the soil and it gives you a nice, good playing field where you're reducing that weed seed bank. And then from there, you have a low weed seed bank and then you can work from there, know what weed species you have. It's not going to eliminate your perennials, but it's going to really knock them back. We're not there now. So what I would do is I would probably, check your soil fertility. I'd probably do your soil prep now if you can, till it, get it ready because you're not going to get many weed seeds germinating now. If you have perennials, I would try your best to get rid of them. If you're able to spray a systemic herbicide, that would be great. Or just do lots of weeding. And then I would put on a lot of mulch and learn, right? You're going to learn exactly what weeds you have, what are the problem species. Maybe the first year you don't want to plant big and a lot of long-term perennials, but plant some temporary plants to help you learn. But if you have no idea what weed species are there, you really need to learn.
I think those are all great tips. Thank you so much, Mark. I'll mention that we do have a couple of soil webinars coming up in the coming weeks. And also we're going to have Mark back on October 10th for some more Q&A. So if your question didn't get answered today, we can certainly ask him that if you can join us for that program. So thanks everybody so much for coming here. There'll be a survey that pops up after we're done here, and we appreciate your feedback. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.